I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a professor at Berry College. I'm a school psychologist, and I chair our psychology department and direct our applied behavior analysis program. But maybe what's most relevant to this talk is I grew up in Dunwoody, Georgia. My father was a psychologist working at a large institution there. At the time, it was called the Georgia Retardation Center, later became known as Brook Run. And so I grew up going to family events, spending time even in an internship in their genetics lab with people with intellectual disabilities that were living in an institutional setting. I became really interested in that population. And more recently, I've become really interested in the institutions themselves and what that tells us about society, how we've, the reflection of how understanding how societies address the needs of people, the most vulnerable in our population, how that tells us something about ourselves in society.
A little bit about myself. I'm a native of Bartow County. I'm a professor of Southern History at Auburn University, where I teach courses on public history, kind of like teaching students to one day work in museums like the Bartow History Museum, as well as archives and so forth. A few years ago, I published a book, The Long Civil War in the North Georgia Mountains, that's about Bartow County's history during the antebellum and Reconstruction periods. And for several years now, I've worked pretty closely with the Bartow History Museum to do a variety of tours and programs, all to sort of tell deeper, richer stories about this area's history and sort of expose sort of unrevealed sort of truths about the past here in Bartow County as well.
Well, what got me interested in this subject initially was an invitation to serve on the board of Hickory Log Personal Care Home for men with developmental disabilities here in Bartow County in White, Georgia. And of course, I was already interested in understanding how best to support people with intellectual disabilities, in particularly adults, which there's a lot less research and services and support in our culture for adults with disabilities. And after being involved for just a year or so on the board, I became aware of the fascinating history of that particular place. How at one point it was the county pauper farm or poorhouse. There is this pauper cemetery adjacent to the today Hickory Log. And then at one point it was actually a county home for indigent people, elderly people. And became really interested in thinking about why that land has retained the same sort of need or function of caring for a population of citizens that seem unable or deemed unable to work or to take care of themselves, and why is it that this has sustained this kind of role? And so I continued on the board, fundraising and trying to address the great needs there, but then luckily got connected with Keith, who has this historical perspective that I didn't have. The Bartow History Museum was really helpful in sort of giving me a head start in thinking about using archival data, sharing newspaper and other records with me to kind of start thinking about this story.
I think I became interested in this story just through personal experience growing up in Bartow County. When I went to college, I read this book called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. It's a famous essay by James Agee and the photographer Walker Evans. They really exposed to the country the level of persistent poverty in the American South. And for many people, it was sort of the first, this was published back in the 30s, but it was sort of the first sort of documentary sort of evidence of this that was sort of widespread. And instantly, when I opened up that book as a 20-something-year-old, I was struck by the photographs of Walker Evans, because staring back at me were these faces of children who actually seemed quite familiar to me. And they were familiar to me because growing up in Bartow County near Taylorsville and Kingston area, riding the school bus every day for years and years and years, I interacted with those children every day. And in many cases, I was pretty close to being one of those children as well. I watched our school bus driver hand meals to the kids as they got off the bus that she provided herself, not that the school provided. I saw children with rotten teeth, all types of sort of conditions, living in the same places and buildings that were photographed back in the 30s. And I started thinking to myself, well, that was in the 80s when I was seeing this. So the sort of persistence of sort of poverty and our ability in the South to sort of ignore that and sort of pretend it doesn't exist, or at least do enough to sort of change and shape public policy to really adequately address this, is something I've really been interested in for a long time, just from my own sort of personal experience. Then I was fortunate enough to meet Michelle, and Michelle kind of, honestly for me, while I sort of had run across the pauper farm in historical records doing my book, she places it in this whole new context of sort of public policy moving forward, and it's really provided me this great education on all of the sort of different ways our society has tried at times to address these things, but unfortunately, largely still kind of fallen short for doing these things. So, I really love to see history as sort of this holistic sort of pie that, the stuff of today when we go out to Hickory Log and I'm meeting with those gentlemen out there, these really talented individuals. I try to picture myself in 1840s Bartow County interacting with similar, the individuals would have been in that society as well, and try to picture some aspect of their life during that time.
It has been, so during the course of my research, trying to understand the origins of Hickory Log, I think in terms of interesting and impactful, I think what I have uncovered is just how, and maybe historians like Keith have always known this, but it wasn't really part of my training as a psychologist and an applied psychologist, is just how history is just with you all the time, and the same kinds of reasons why people are living at Hickory Log today, and a lot of the same reasons are why people were living in the pauper farm in the 1800s. This idea that work is so valued, being employed and being able to support yourself is this ideal in our society. And what does it mean if you're a person that can't do that? I mean, are you still a valuable citizen? Are there better ways to eliminate or minimize barriers to people getting employment if they can't on their own because of physical, cognitive, psychological, whatever, sociological variables, sustain employment, find employment? And it's sort of like taking me in all kinds of really interesting directions. Thinking about the history, thinking about past policies and how we got to where we are now. It's vital to understand the past in order to plan and think constructively about the future. And lastly, I'll just say that just this ability to do interdisciplinary work, to collaborate with a historian, to learn about how to use archival documents. I mean, I do experimental research. It's really different than sitting in a museum or a library and looking at boxes of newspaper articles and written documents and trying to piece together those stories. But the stories are the same. They're age-old themes. So it's all fascinating, but some of the interesting ways that I've gone about understanding history in contemporary issues has been illuminating.
I believe the most interesting part of this project to me is I'm very interested in historical landscapes and how the landscape of Bartow County at times reflects its social and cultural values, how we use the land, where we place people on that land, the relationship between those people and institutions. We tend to think of institutions like churches and schools, but there are other very important institutions in Bartow history that we may not always want to acknowledge. And the pauper farm is kind of one of those. The pest houses are one. But the connection between the pauper farm And the Sugar Hill convict lease camp that was just right, in fact, adjoined in some cases, the pauper farm, to me in the late 19th century is really sort of fascinating, because at Sugar Hill they're placing incarcerated individuals to work in mines at, for no labor, no money at all, in really horrid conditions. But oftentimes when people from Cartersville would go out to visit the pauper farm, they'd visit the mines and they'd draw comparisons between the two, and oftentimes sort of equate the people who are poor with people who may or may not have been rightfully convicted of crimes, but who were seen as criminals. And to me, I think that's really important. I think landscape really helps us, paying attention to landscape helps us understand the past a little bit. When you have a landscape where the poor, the intellectually disabled, the physically disabled, orphans, widows, women who were divorced were considered disabled in this society, okay? And you place them next to people who are seen as dangerous criminals, and that's how the public sort of groups them together at times. There's sort of this, I can imagine sort of closing my eyes and traveling out to where hickory log is today, back in the 1890s, the early 1900s. And the people you would have been traveling with, mostly white sort of reformers from Cartersville, probably would have felt like they were entering into some kind of dangerous terrain. Like this is sort of another sort of landscape. Well, today you just drive out, that's where Toyo Tire is, and you got these nice little stories about the town of White and Pine Log, and there's not a lot on the landscape in terms of commemoration, historical markers, monuments, driving tours, the things that reveal this history to you. And I think that's something that we're really sort of missing. It'd be nice to, through our project, through a lot of stuff that we're doing, is to try to unveil some of that to folks and maybe help them understand where sort of the residents of Hickory Log today sort of fit into Bartow County's current life, but also in its past sort of history as well.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much to you both for your lecture today. It was fantastic.